Okay, I think it is working now. Somebody could just confirm that, I'd be grateful. Good. Get the studio off in another window. Good. Somebody can tell me the audio levels are okay. I think it is working now. Perfect. We're a little bit slow today, having some internet trouble, but thanks for coming aboard. Welcome back. We only have, I think, this week and next week content-wise. So I hope everybody's doing well out there. This week I'm going to talk a little bit about one more historical case study, which is propaganda content in totalitarian systems specifically, because I think these have really kind of interesting aspects and dimensions that could be perhaps illuminating to disinformation online. So here's where we are in the class. So online quiz 2 closed April 5th. If you missed it for whatever reason, send me an email so we can figure something out. Meanwhile, your short essays are due April 12th, or that would be Sunday night. So if you haven't started yet, please start that now. Go on FOL. It's under evaluations, submissions, and then you'll see those essay assignment instructions. I have provided topics, lots of topics. I definitely don't want to see an essay on a different topic if you do not clear it with me first. Send me an email, say I would rather write about this other thing, but you need to clear it with me first if you want to write on another topic. Finally, we have the presentations and a final test. The final test is just another quiz. I call it the final test. It's just slightly longer than the other quizzes, but don't freak out about the final test. It is cumulative, but it should be pretty straightforward. If you're not sure how to create a presentation, how to structure it, I just want to you should just take your case study and turn it into a presentation. If you've been in a COM class, COM 3000, COM 6000, your COM class has made you do something like this very similarly. You take a research report, you turn it into a presentation. That's kind of the template I was thinking of here. So that's what we're going to be doing as we close out the class. Seeing some comments here. I was a little bit late on some things. Okay, so last week we discussed the idea of propaganda and public relations in democratic societies. So the expansion of democracy in Europe and North America was really very much a push coming out of what we call the Age of Enlightenment. And a lot of it had to do with the idea that human beings are rational and as a result could be entrusted with, participation in the decision-making process. In the 20th century, with Freudianism and postmodernism, you had increasing kind of suspicion and critiques of the ideals of the Enlightenment. In particular, you had a kind of an increasing view that human beings also had these kind of irrational aspects to them. A very prominent critique was Freud, whose view of the human mind was that we're not rational. We have these unconscious desires, and these unconscious desires motivate our actions, not reason. And the potential for the irrationality of the mob was really a disastrous potential, as the experience of the First World War showed Freud, and as the Second World War really kind of underscored. So Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, who kind of wrote the book on propaganda and public relations, said, look, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the opinions of the masses is an important element in a democracy. Um, for people like Bernays, public relations and manipulation of the masses was not anti-democratic. In fact, it was really important for a democracy. Um, the idea is that in a democracy, individuals and groups should be free to use all the tools required to kind of create public acceptance for an idea. That's just part of having a public sphere. He writes, right, the invisible intertwining structure of groupings and associations is the mechanism by which democracy has organized its group mind and simplified its mass thinking. To deplore the existence of such a mechanism is to ask for a society such as never was and never will be. To admit that it exists, but expect that it shall not be used, is unreasonable. So groupings and associations, right? What Bernays has in mind is what we would call today like a lobby group, whether it's the National Rifle Association or, a Citizens Climate Lobby, right? This is a normal part of democracy, and they should use all the tools of public relations. And these tools enable people like leaders to do the job of leading, because ours must be what he calls a leadership democracy, administered by the intelligent minority who know how to regiment and guide the masses. So starting as early as the 1920s and 30s, people were very consciously theorizing about the need of, manipulating the masses' opinions and thinking of it as not subverting democracy, but as a really critical element of democracy. Let me just respond to a comment here real quick. Just typing a little comment here. So, one of the essay questions is kind of evaluating this vision that Edward Bernays has of a leadership democracy where we have to kind of manage the opinions of the masses because of their irrationality. Is this a good view? Is it bad? Does it undermine democracy? Is it neither good or bad, just kind of inevitable? However we think about this, one of the important aspects that I really want to mention is that there are kind of constraints placed on public relations and propaganda in a democracy. These constraints on how far manipulation can go make it really different from a use of propaganda in a totalitarian system, like North Korea, like the Soviet Union, like Nazi Germany, right? In a democracy, of course, we have freedom of association, we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of the press, right, of movement. We can, not right now because we're all under quarantine, but usually we have freedom of movement, right, of religion, which means that an argument made in the public sphere by a lobby group, by any group, can be countered by another group who would be able to say, stop, I think your argument's bad, by a journalist who might go, actually, your data's bad, you're lying, right? So there are constraints placed on public relations in a functioning democracy. And the more dysfunctional the democracy, the less functioning the democracy, the worse your PR problem is going to be, all right? Because without countervailing influences, without something pushing back against the conscious manipulation of the opinions of the masses, propaganda could really become a very destructive force, a very repressive force. So before I jump into propaganda in the totalitarian context, in the context where there is no thing pushing against it, let me give you some terms and definitions, because I will use words like fascism, communism, socialism, totalitarianism, democracy, ideology, but what do these terms actually mean? So here's kind of how I'm going to be using them. I'm not saying this is the one right way to think of these ideas, but hopefully it'll kind of be a start. So we're going to say something like totalitarianism is a form of government that prohibits all opposition parties. So there's no opposition, there is only one ruling power. It also severely restricts individual freedom. So all the freedoms we saw earlier in democracy, like freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on, are gone. And it will exercise a really high degree of control over people's public and private lives. By public lives, we mean like our work lives, our arguments in the public sphere, what we do out in public, and also in private life, what you say in confidence to your friends, who and whether you're allowed to marry the certain people, right? Nazi Germany had these laws that said, German citizens couldn't marry people who are of a quote-unquote different racial background. So we have an extreme degree of control over public and private life. Now, totalitarianism can come in many forms. In the case of far-right totalitarianisms, right, we have things like fascism, Nazism. Now, fascism was a political ideology that was mainly prominent, right? We're thinking the late 20s, 30s, 40s, until its decisive defeat in World War II. Fascism is really hard to define. It's often you'll have a bunch of features, but it's also a very kind of pragmatic ideology. But you will often see kind of a militaristic ethnic nationalism, which, what do those words mean? You definitely have a lot of emphasis on the military, on force as a solution to problems, and power in international relations being really like over diplomacy being the kind of the main driver here. And ethnic nationalism for fascism means that we identify the nation state with a specific folk, a specific people. Fascism is also opposed to electoral democracy. So again, we're going to be banning opposition parties. If there's an election, it's going to be kind of a sham election. The Soviet Union had fake elections. Of course, the Soviet Union was a fascist. It was communist. It's other thing. Fascism also typically has a strong belief in a natural social hierarchy and elite rule. But what you're going to have is a lot of variation in different countries, because every country that had a fascist government had its own twist on it, right? So Italy had a very different fascist government than Germany, and Germany had a very different fascist government than, say, Spain under Franco's rule. So Nazi Germany specifically had an extremely, what they call Volk, which is German for folk, had a type of fascism that was extremely focused on notions of racial purity. Often, but not necessarily anti-intellectual, centered around party rule, definitely focus on the need to eliminate racial opponents and intellectual opponents. Some people sometimes stress the idea that Nazism is short for National Socialism, but there's nothing socialist about National Socialism. I have a couple links here. This link is a historian's analysis of the economy under Nazi Germany, which was not a socialist economy. The Night of the Long Knives here is, of course, a purge by the Nazi Party of any kind of elements that were opposed to Nazi rule within the party. So what we have is a kind of a purge of certain paramilitary elements that were more socialistic, I suppose you could say. Anyway, there's a lot of history here. I just mentioned this because there's kind of a meme where people argue online that the Nazis were kind of far left or something. No serious historian thinks that. What about... I'm just going to try and go through here. Okay, we have an interesting comment down here. Would it benefit society to control people who breed, to remove the weakened genes and stuff? So yeah, eugenics is generally an awful idea, I'm going to type here. And partially because we don't really have a strong sense of what counts as quote-unquote weakened or bad genetics. Some of the people that are most useful, and I really don't like thinking of people in terms of their usefulness, were actually classified as undesirable under the Nazis, for example. So people on the autism spectrum disorder, people have autism spectrum disorder who have Asperger's, were viewed as undesirable, which is insane. So apart from the fact that it kind of goes against the dignity of all human beings, in practice it doesn't even do what it says it's supposed to do. Because in fact it's human diversity that is most useful to us. But that's a tangent I don't really want to get into here. Very briefly, we're also going to be talking about Soviet totalitarianism, which is based in communism. What is communism? Well, it's fundamentally a Marxist idea. So there's an ideology which says we should replace private property in a profit-based economy with state ownership and central planning, typically via violent revolution and the seizure of assets and property. How this works is that private property is abolished in one sense only. So you're allowed owning something. I could own my phone, my toothbrush. Well, you can't, nobody should be able to own the factory that makes the phones, the factory that makes the toothbrushes under communism. So what we have is collective ownership of the means of production. That would include things like houses and farms. So generally it's a pretty bad idea. But I'll get into why shortly. So that's what I mean. So communism, right, specifically says that we should have central planning and a public ownership of the means of production. Of course, public means the state, means the party, and not actually like a democratic control of the economy. And within communism, of course, you have Stalinism, the economy under Stalin, which was its own thing. And both these are kind of offshoots of Marxism, a method of socioeconomic analysis that thinks of, right, what is the primary driver of history? Right, it's the economy, it's class relations, social conflict. And I really want to make a distinction between Marxism as an ideology on one hand, which I'll talk about more in a sec, and socialism, which predates Marxism and says, look, we should think about democratic ownership of some of the economy. This is compatible with a partially capitalistic market economy and parliamentary democracy. There's just some things that are not well suited to the free market. Some things are, some things aren't, and then we just figure out how much and where. So socialism is not necessarily Marxism. Marxism is a specific political ideology. But I will get into that in a sec here. One other thing I want to flag is this common idea that collectivism and individualism are really kind of abstract ideas that explain political divisions at a fundamental level. But when I'm talking about a far-right form of totalitarianism like Nazism and a far-left form of totalitarianism like Soviet communism, I really don't think it's useful to think of it in terms of collectivism and individualism, because some people say, look, the left is collectivist, the right is individualistic, and I don't think that actually captures most of the divisions here. There's obviously right-wing forms of collectivism, right? Military dictatorships, racial policies of apartheid and segregation, right? And on a really fundamental level, I think there's kind of a weird paradox we have to come to grips with here, is that some forms of collective action really enrich individual human freedom. And I'm thinking of things like a collective notion like human rights applying to everyone, equality before the law, right? That's a collective thing that enriches the individual. And on the other side, some forms of hyper-individualism can result in hierarchies that are difficult to justify from the point of view of human freedom. And so there's a range of really subtle issues. So I don't want us to approach far left and far right ideologies in terms of collectivism, individualism. It's going to kind of confuse our thinking here. And how am I going to think about left and right in the totalitarian context is I'm kind of going to ignore it a little bit and just talk about ideology. When we think about the political left and the political right, the terms originate in a weird way. They come from the seating arrangements that occurred in the French National Assembly during the French Revolution. So what happened is that supporters of the monarchy, of the Ancien Régime, of the old regime of the king, sat to the right of the chair, the chair of the assembly. And all the revolutionaries sat to the left. So the right is the monarchists, the left is the revolutionaries. So that's where these terms first kind of came out of. Historically, right, since 1789, left and right have represented really diverse coalitions of interests and views that just shift over time, that are different from country to country, from context to context. And I don't want to have these generalizations that left is collective, right is individual, left is big government, right is small government. Just don't think in these two simplistic terms. We should identify specific political movements and actors in specific historical contexts and be really careful of making grand abstract claims. The right wing of the United States has shifted tremendously in the last 10, 15 years on a number of issues like trade, like immigration, right? Like the role of the international alliance system. So we can't think in terms of like one consistent abstract concept the whole time. Instead, I'm going to talk about specific ideologies in their time. So if we talk about fascism, what we're talking about is a totalitarian state that is totalitarian because it doesn't recognize limits on its authority in the public or private sphere. Mussolini wrote that everything is within the state, nothing is outside the state, nothing can be against the state. It's in a sense deeply collectivist because it treats the state and everything in it as an organic whole. In fact, that's where the word fascism comes from fascia, which is kind of intertwined bundles, thus being stronger for being intertwined. But it's also fundamentally inegalitarian in its approach to society. So as Mussolini writes in the Doctrine of Fascism, he says, look, fascism is opposed to socialism, to which unity within the state is unknown, and which sees in history nothing but class struggle. Fascism denies that the majority, through the mere fact of being a majority, can rule human societies. It affirms the irremediable, fruitful, and beneficent inequality of men which cannot be leveled. So whereas the rhetoric of Marxist socialism was that, right, citizens should be equal economically, politically, fascism says people are unequal and the state has this mandate to rule and overrule the majority. So fascism and socialism were really directly opposed in the 1920s. Mussolini says, private enterprise, capitalism is the most effective and useful instrument in the interest of the nation. The state can, of course, mandate the direction of production, but fascism liked the market economy. At least it says it liked it because the idea of competition and struggle in the market really kind of resonated with the fascist view that people were unequal and there's the weak and the strong get to rule over the weak. So market competition was just a reflection of human competition, which is just part of this inequality of people. So how did this view gain political prominence? Well, of course, if you know a little bit about history, it's really about the aftermath of the First World War. Specifically in Germany, we have crisis after crisis, hyperinflation, right, a collapsed economy, massive unemployment. And one of the kind of big theorists of fascism in Germany was a guy called Carl Schmitt. He said, look, democracies states can enter a state of emergency. And in a state of emergency, the powers of the sovereign state are unlimited. And the idea of the nation, who is the state, who enters into this state of emergency, well, you can define the nation state in oppositional terms to an enemy that's out there. You only have an us because there's a them. What he calls something existentially, something different, something alien to the state, creates a sense of unity, sustains the emergency, and explains why we can have unlimited state power. In fact, for fascist theorists, sovereignty is just kind of defined as whoever is the entity capable of declaring the state of emergency. So if you look at the kind of political development of the fascist state in Germany, it's something similar happening in Italy. By 1933, we have the Decree of the Reich, President for the Protection of People and State. We have a suspension of civil liberties in Germany. We have the Nazi Party jailing its opponents, closing newspapers. Here we have a newspaper, Das andere Deutschland. Its last issue it printed, announcing in its last issue that it was now a forbidden newspaper. It was verboten. And the Nazi Party, really interestingly, never formally repealed the Constitution of Weimar Republic Germany. They just ruled by a series of decrees created by the emergency powers of the 1933 Act. So secret police, arbitrary jailing, execution were all really justified legally from 1933 on as a result of the Emergency Powers Act. And this is the actual tax order for the Reich President for the Protection of People and State. This is the actual act, just translated to English from the German. The following is ordered in defense against communist state endangering acts of violence. Where the Constitution or the articles of the Constitution are suspended until further notice, permissible to restrict the rights of personal freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, organize and assemble, right? Privacy, right? All that is gone. The warrants for house searches, confiscations, restrictions on property are permissible beyond the legal limits otherwise prescribed. Right, so we see here the totalitarian state really asserting its power over the public and private spheres and pushing away all the restraints of the democratic system under this idea that there's an emergency. In this case, right, communist state endangering acts of violence. The Reichstag fire, of course, the Reichstag, the Houses of Parliament were set on fire. And this was used as kind of an excuse for this to for this legislation to happen. So apart from asserting its power, from being deeply hierarchical, deeply anti-socialist, what else is fascism? Ideologically speaking, it's hard to really put a definition on fascism because in practice it's very malleable, very opportunistic. Especially when it comes to policy, the Nazis really didn't have any specific economic policy beliefs. The Nazi Party privatized some state enterprises, right? So by privatization, I mean they sold stuff the state had, so it kind of like desocialized itself. On the other hand, its rearmament programs and defense contracts really comprised at some points most of the economy. So these contracts largely respected the private property regime of the pre-Nazi period, so there was no strict central economic planning. And I talk about this because Italy, for example, is completely different. The government controlled almost 80% of the economy, even while at the same time Mussolini down in Italy kept defending the virtues of private enterprise in his speeches and in his books. So you have a bunch of contradictions here. So the country that called itself National Socialist had the least socialism, and Fascist Italy, whose rhetoric was all about markets and competition, had the most central planned economy. Fascism has kind of a theoretical focus on action. You have to be decisive, you have to move, you don't have democracy, right? You're not really constrained by the old rules, and you have kind of a lack of real policy coherence here. But one central component to Nazism as an ideology was this kind of racial component. Um, it identified these literally dozens of racial categories and placed them in a strict hierarchical order. Um, what you have to understand here is that when we're talking about Aryan, we're not just talking about white people, because the Nazis didn't really believe there were white people the way we believe there. And again, I'm using scare quotes here, white people, because our racial categories are kind of social. Um, the Nazis believed there was a Nordic race that was superior, although Germany had a high population of what they called the Alpine race, and you could correct this through selective breeding. And here we have a map of the proportion of the various European breeding stocks in Europe that the Nazis came up with. If you do like a deep dive into this, you'll find that it makes zero sense, right? So you have like the Mediterranean people down here, you have the Alpines, you have some Nordic up here. We wouldn't think to make these distinctions today. Well, the Nazis were all about like really creating a lot of these minute distinctions that we don't think of as intuitive. Um, Eastern Europeans were viewed as subhuman, right? People, Slavic people, Jewish people, Roma were viewed as racially inferior, sometimes called life unworthy of life, to be eliminated to make room for superior races. Was really central component of Nazi ideology here. And in the ramp up to genocide, they passed these racial hygiene laws, um, accompanied by a lot of propaganda, which is what I want to talk about, to educate the public on these ideas. If you look at the So here's the Wikipedia article on racial policy in Nazi Germany. Let's just look at this picture here. So we have a scientist measuring the skull to determine what race this person really was. And it's nonsense. Let me make that absolutely clear. But the Nazis were pretty systematic about it. So later on, as people tried to understand what fascism was in the 50s and 60s, apart from, for example, the Nazis' obsession with race, the level of policy, what you had was like a really kind of deep incoherence. Umberto Eco said Mussolini had no philosophy, he was just rhetoric. Fascism is contradictory. And what you want is hierarchy and power, mostly in fascism. And however you achieve that at the level of policy, it doesn't matter. You don't need to be consistent. The only thing the Nazis were really consistent about were their kind of racial policies. But let's look at some of the characteristics of fascism that Umberto Eco gave. He's a famous author and philosopher. So what he says, let me just go back here, right? These characteristics are not a system, because fascism is not a system. Many are in fact mutually exclusive, but all you need is one of them to be present, and a fascist kind of nebula will begin to coagulate. So the idea is that we have these kind of characteristics, and they're more or less present in more or less amounts wherever there is fascism. So fascism is centered on a cult of tradition, right? There's kind of this nation as a glorious past, and it's really important we recapture that. Italian fascists were all about the glory of the Roman Empire. If you go online and you hang out a little bit with Nazis online, which I don't recommend, you'll see that there's definitely a cult of tradition. There's definitely a lot of talk about empires past and how glorious we were, and if only we'd go back to this kind of really militaristic imperialism of the empires of old. So this cult of tradition is an essential aspect of fascism. You also have a rejection of modernity and rationalism and democracy in favor of nationalism and instinct. You have a cult of action. You have a deep suspicion of intellectuals. We have a rejection of doubt and criticism. Dissent is a betrayal of state unity. We have a fundamental exploitation of xenophobia. In fact, Eco says, look, often the initial appeal of fascism is a warning against invasion by intruders, alien by them. So you create a deep sense of us and them. You appeal to xenophobia. You warn about people coming in, about intruders, and that's how you kind of build up a populist base. You do so through appeal to an internal frustrated social class. The frustrations are economic, social changes, political humiliation. For example, in Germany, the 1920s, you had all three of these. Right? You had the economic crisis. You have hyperinflation. The German mark is basically worthless. You have a lot of social pressure at the time. Society is changing. And you have the political humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, which the Germans were made to sign after World War I. So a very potent combination. A lot of unemployed, frustrated young people. And you want to cultivate a sense of ethnic nationalism. And you want to define it in contrast with kind of a vague international enemy that's conspiring both within and without society. Now, at this point, I've been talking about fascism for about 36 minutes. And now I want to stop and say there's a link here to disinformation and misinformation and propaganda online. If you kind of start following propagandists online, you start looking at misinformation, you're going to start seeing some of this stuff pop up. You are definitely going to see, if you go on the right Facebook pages, a lot of xenophobia. You're going to see a lot of warning about intruders. It could be hyped up stories about migrants, right? With illegals. It could be stories about people that are Muslim, and again, the framing of these issues is to not have kind of a reasonable policy discussion, but to inflame xenophobia through appeal to a frustrated social class. And then you define that in terms of us versus them. There's an international enemy. One term I come across very frequently when I start diving into the world of fake news is something like globalism, right? Which is, we're defining an international enemy. And often in these kind of globalist conspiracies, what you have is immigration as kind of one of the globalist weapons. So you have definitely some of the kind of like the fascist elements in some of this rhetoric here. Nevertheless, the enemy is decadent and defeatable, and part of the appeal of this view is also that what is life? Life is a kind of a struggle. It's war. There can be no peace, and the goal of your life is not to be happy. The goal of life is not freedom, but contribution to the war effort. Again, this is often a good recruitment tactic for frustrated young men, age 17 to 25 or so, right? They don't want to be happy. They want to contribute to a struggle. They want to suffer a little bit because life is war and conflict and being tough and being a man. Let me just kind of run through these a little bit more quickly, right? So we also have in fascism a scorn for the weak, a cult of heroism and heroic action, and therefore permanent war and heroism is also a guide to gender roles. So fascism will typically have very rigid, very traditional gender roles. So we have a lot of machismo. Women should have traditional roles. Sexual nonconformity is always going to be condemned. So we expect a lot of homophobia, a lot of transphobia, very rigid gender roles in fascism. The people actually all have a common will. There are no elements within a democracy that are heterogeneous. We shouldn't think of democracy as a conflict between groups that we resolve through democratic institutions. There is just the people. They have a common will, and the leader interprets the will of the people. Democratic institutions are rotten. They're corrupt. They will not get through the will of the people viewed as a unified whole. And of course, a lot of euphemism, cliche, and slogans to limit complex and critical reasoning. So notice that a lot of these features don't have to do with specific policy. They don't have to do with what a fascist thinks of the economy, what a fascist thinks of the environment, what a fascist thinks about international relations, and any of the kind of complex issues of policy that in daily life go through parliamentary democracy. A lot of this has to do with rhetoric, the rhetoric of heroic action, of war, of scorn for the weak, of the xenophobic enemy out there, about the use of cliches and slogans to limit critical reasoning. These are all rhetorical moves, which is why a deep understanding of what fascism is so crucial to understanding some forms of propaganda online which have fascistic tendencies. Let me just pivot a little bit after talking about fascism to Marxism. Marxist totalitarianism was pretty different in some ways and pretty similar in other ways. Let me just give you, but it's very different in the following way, in that Marxism came out of a theoretical tradition that whereas fascism is loose and mainly guided by rhetoric, Marxism is very rigid and ideological and guided by a set of ideas. And the rigidity of these ideas is part of what creates problems. So the roots of Marxism have to go back to a philosopher called Hegel. Now, nobody remembers Hegel today almost outside of an influence on Marx. Hegel had a view that history progressed in inevitable stages. History has stages. The stages go a little bit like this. You start with a thesis, which is like an idea, the guiding idea of the age. The thesis eventually results in an antithesis. The antithesis is the rejection of the main idea of that age. Now, the rejection of the idea is because people react to ideas. It could be because the idea has contradictions in it, and the contradictions get worse and worse. And finally, there's conflict, which resulting in synthesis, which is a new thesis that kind of combines the two, the thesis and the antithesis. So Hegel argued that these ideas drove history. We have an idea, it has contradictions, we resolve the contradictions, we get a new idea. If I give you an example here, right, so think about music in the 1980s, right? So we have the thesis is hair metal, I don't know, John Bon Jovi. The antithesis is Nirvana. Nirvana as a band was everything the 80s wasn't. And what's the synthesis? The part that brings together the two? Nickelback. Nickelback is one part grunge, one part John Bon Jovi, boom. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I know it's 2020 and I'm talking about music from 30 years ago, but bear with me here. So Marx took Hegel's idea that history progresses in inevitable stages of, right, a stable state, contradiction, and then a synthesis where the contradiction is resolved, and said it's not about ideas, it's about the economy. The primary driver of history is economic relations. More specifically, struggle between classes in an economic system. So Marx says, look, the capitalist stage is part of the thesis. But capitalism has contradictions. Eventually, it'll be met by its antithesis. And then will be the synthesis, the output of that will eventually be communism, the final stage of development. Because once you don't have class, economic class, the rich, the poor, the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, so on, there can't be conflict, and history is over. There'll be no more progress. So what we should do is usher in the classless stage of history, and then, right, we'll have achieved the perfect system. This is obviously a garbage idea. Don't get me wrong here. I present it because it's a bad idea. And this progress is more or less inevitable. So as Engels wrote, who's the co-author of the Communist Manifesto, he says, look, our view of kind of the historical development is that the course of history, which seeks the ultimate cause and the great moving power of all important events, is in the economic development of society, in the change of the modes of production and exchange, the division of society into distinct classes, and in the struggles of those classes against one another. Right? All society is just the history of the struggle between classes. So we have really, again, this is a very deeply theoretical view and type of analysis here, which is, again, really pulls apart from fascism, which is an anti-theoretical view. Um, for Marx, again, I'm going to try to go a little bit faster here. The final stage of development, which is communism, is only going to occur when the productive forces of capitalism reach a stage where we're free from scarcity, right? It should be only then that the class system will be abolished, which will be the communist revolution. Freedom from scarcity. What is scarcity? Scarcity is not having enough. So eventually, capitalism will do a very good job developing the economy, and we're going to get to a point where we are free from want, and then capitalism's contradictions will be most apparent, causing a revolution. If you ever watch Star Trek, right, there's something called a replicator. A replicator is just a little box where you go up and you say what you want, and then it creates it for you, basically for free. So if you're hungry, just go up to the box and say, replicator, computer, can you make me a hamburger? And then it'll just create for you a hamburger out of thin air. Now, if you had to pay for this, if you had to give like $5 of your Star Trek salary to give a burger out of the replicator, when in fact it costs nothing to make, there's something really weird happening, according to Marx. And the kind of contradiction there will make eventually people will just revolt and say, why am I paying money for something that costs nothing to make? Right? And we should just stop doing this, right? The communist revolution. Of course, this is not at all what happened. Let me just skip ahead a couple slides here. So Marx says, look, a country with an advanced industrial economy, right, that is near post-scarcity would be the first to transition to communism because the contradictions of capitalism would be most pronounced there. But that's obviously not what happened. Capitalist economies recovered from their crises in the 30s and 40s. In fact, every time there's a recession or a crash, right, we kind of recover. And for really complex historical reasons, Russia underwent revolution in 1917. Was Russia an advanced industrial capitalist economy? No, it was the opposite. It was an agrarian feudal country. And the revolution was led not by the average person, by a vanguard party, a small group of elites under the leadership of Lenin. After Lenin died, Stalin consolidated power, reoriented Soviet policy, exiled and murdered his opposition, and everything went from bad to even worse. And so sometimes people distinguish between Marxism as a theory and then communism as it's been implemented in places like Russia, China, North Korea, wherever. And I think that's a distinction that is not really tenable. Marx himself had a deep theoretical focus on revolution, and I think that's a really bad failure, a moral failure. Violent revolutions are really bloody affairs. They destabilize societies. They lead to the breakdown of all the systems that keep people fed, housed, and safe, and warm, right? Peaceful, non-violent revolutions work better. Non-violent movements are more successful. Normal, non-theoretical, non-Marxist politics can bring about incremental and stable improvements over time, and every piece of history we look at confirms that. As somebody who, I mean, you might have noticed, right, obviously, I'm probably more on the contemporary political left than the right-ish, but at the same time, the left is not Marxism and Marxism is not the left. Marxism is just wrong. Millions have paid the price for this view that violent revolution and seizure of the means of production is the only way forward out of capitalism. Right? And they write this in the Communist Manifesto. The violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat, right? The non-ownership class who are driven to revolution. So I think the Marxist emphasis on revolution and the seizure of the means of production is really a very deadly theoretical commitment to have. I just wanted to kind of flag that there, lest you think that I'm sympathetic to this stuff, because I'm just not. All right. Communism. So let's talk about. So that's how much time have I been going on here for? 49 minutes. So all these communist revolutions occurred in countries that did not kind of meet Marx's preconditions for quote-unquote revolution, right? Russia, China, elsewhere, these were not advanced capitalist economies. So all these ideas like Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism are ideological variants that kind of filled in the gaps here. All right, let me not talk about too much about the history here because I'm already at 50 minutes, and let's talk a little bit about propaganda, how it operates under these two really opposed totalitarian systems. Again, on the one hand, you have the totalitarian system of fascism, which is mostly focused on maintaining and creating a state hierarchy on the basis of a certain kind of rhetoric of war, machismo, and xenophobia. And on the other hand, you have this kind of Marxist totalitarianism, which is a very theoretical view about the necessary development of the stages of history from capitalism to communism. And nevertheless, they ended up looking rather similar to each other. And I want to talk about totalitarian propaganda through the work of Hannah Arendt. She was a political theorist. She was a philosopher born in Germany to a Jewish family, very narrowly escaped the Holocaust. She was in a Nazi internment camp, but she left it on a kind of an illegal fake visa issued by an American diplomat. And like pretty much anyone who was on the continent, in continental Europe during that period from 1930, 1940, right? These were really crucial years. And pretty much any intellectual in Europe who lived through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, you cannot separate their work from that period. So Hannah Arendt in particular has a really twisted relationship to Nazi Germany. She was a student of and had a relationship with Martin Heidegger, who was a very prominent German philosopher. And Martin Heidegger eventually joined and supported the Nazi Party in Germany. This was a party dedicated to the extermination of Arendt and her family, and in fact all Jewish people. But he wrote a letter to Hannah saying, the Nazi Party cannot touch my relationship to you. So this experience, a close friend, a former lover, your teacher, your mentor, joining a party committed to murder, to her murder, while claiming to remain close and unaffected, really disturbed Arendt. Like, how can you reconcile these two thoughts in your brain? That we have a relationship that's significant and you care about me, but you're going to support policies that will result in my death. And in fact, almost did. So we have George Orwell called it doublethink, right? In 1984, said like one of the most fundamental commandments of the state in 1984 was the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts at the same time, and not just not reconcile it, but not worry about it, not even notice there's a contradiction. So Arendt set out to understand totalitarianism. And I think she correctly understood that Nazism and Stalinism had a lot in common, despite these really different intellectual roots, these really different origins. What was the totalitarianism in the 30s and 40s just broke down the traditional political categories that people have been using. So where was the similarity? Arendt said, look, totalitarianism is a mass movement. Each individual's life is only important in relation to this new higher purpose. This will be enforced by mass terror and mass propaganda, both for communism and fascism. The mass movement is going to recruit among isolated individuals, right? People that are alienated from society, people that feel they don't have skin in the game, they're atomized, they don't have a lot of relationships. They could be, right? In the 1920s, you had mass unemployment in Germany. And what they wish for more than economic security is meaning with a capital M. They want to work for a great task, which occurs but once in 2,000 years. You're going to hook them by the idea that you're engaging in some kind of deep historical work that'll give your life meaning. And in order to do this, to grab these alienated people and convince them to join a mass movement that is engaged in a certain kind of historical work, right? Meaningful work, where the Nazis used to talk about the 1,000-year Reich, right? That the German Nazi state would last 1,000 years and be monumental and make these kind of massive statues, architecture, right? We're going to do things that will rival the Roman Empire. Right? We're doing something extremely meaningful. How do you do this? You do it through propaganda. The propaganda of mass movements, Arendt says, will conjure up a lying world of consistency, which is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than chaotic reality itself. So the leader of the mass movement creates a cult of personality. So when life feels chaotic and meaningless, you offer a consistent, comprehensible, and predictable vision of the world in which you're contributing to this higher purpose. Because, Arendt says, when it comes to propaganda, what convinces masses are not facts, not even invented facts. You can't just make things up. What really gets people is the consistency of the system of which they are a part. So really crucial to effective mass propaganda is a sense of consistency. That the narrative is consistent, that the enemy is consistent, that the historical analysis is consistent. So you don't want to, it's not just about lying. It's about having a comprehensible, consistent, predictable vision of the world that offers you explanations for everything. You're never at a loss for an explanation. The world isn't chaotic. The world isn't meaningless. There's a system that explains it all for you. Right? If anything bad happens, it's them for the fascist. Right? Who's to blame? Outsiders, intruders, globalists, Jews for the Nazis. Right? Obviously for the Marxist. Right? What we have is a system as well. Capitalism, its contradictions, the inevitable march towards communism. So, to really understand totalitarian propaganda, that is propaganda that is not being pushed back by the democratic apparatus. You have to understand this critical element, which is the consistency of propaganda. The real world is chaotic. Right? If you go out there, there's no simple answers. There's no one ideology that'll fix everything. Right? You can't say, well, we would just fix all social problems if we would just do this. There is no simple answer. Bad things happen at random, right? Good people have bad things happen to them. You could just get cancer and die. And there's no one universal solution. There's no one enemy. In fact, there probably are no enemies. People are just doing their best. Right? Disagreement is legitimate. However, for mass movements propaganda, you get rid of all this chaos and you replace it with a predictable vision of the world. The mass leader does this. The mass leader offers this vision of the world. The leader has a rhetorical ability to turn statements of facts into a declaration of purpose. Fascism in particular is decisive, it's action-oriented. So what you need to understand is that a fascist statement of fact is not really saying something true. They say what would need to be true to do what they want to do. So here's a remark from, this is pretty dark. Yes, it is. It is very dark. So this is from Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a French existentialist in France during World War II. So fascism, or the anti-Semite, does not argue, does not have a kind of a theoretical purchase on reality. They're not trying to win you over. They simply try to project certainty onto the plane of discourse. Right? Never believe that anti-Semites are unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they're amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly. All right? What I mean by there is that, like, when you're arguing with someone who, and there are people online like this, not too many, thankfully, when you're arguing with a fascist or an ideologically committed person online, you're at a disadvantage if you care about truth, because you have to, like, think about the complexity of the real world. But if you're only trying to win because you have a consistent system that you believe in, you have a right to play, as Seth puts it. They like to play with discourse. If you give ridiculous reasons, you discredit the seriousness of your interlocutor. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. If you press them too closely, they will fall silent, indicating by some phrase that the time for argument is past. So you might think of argument as the giving of reasons back and forth, but in the case of certain kinds of ideology, such as fascism, you're not having an argument. Right? What people are doing is just kind of projecting your certainty through your words, and then undermining the very practice of argument. Here's Arendt making basically the same point. Right? So what the masses refuse to recognize is the fortuitousness that pervades reality. So when it comes to mass propaganda, what does that mean? When you have mass propaganda, it trades on the fact that a lot of people don't want to recognize fortuitousness, the chaos that pervades reality. Right? Things happen for no reason all the time. There's no one solution to everything. The masses are predisposed to ideology because it will explain facts as examples of laws. It will eliminate coincidence by inventing an all-embracing omnipotence, supposed to be at the root of every accident. Or so whenever something bad happens, well, I know exactly who it is. It's the enemy, the official enemy. If something bad happens in the Soviet Union, it's saboteurs. Right? It's people who don't have the right politics. People that need to be sent to re-education camps already have an enemy. People that are trying to undermine the glorious revolution. Something bad happens in Germany, it's those globalist Jews trying to undermine us. Right? There are no accidents. Totalitarian propaganda thrives on the escape from reality into fiction. In other words, from coincidence into consistency. So, if, for instance, all the confessions of political opponents in the Soviet Union are phrased in the same language and admit the same motives, the consistency-hungry masses will accept the fiction as supreme proof of their truthfulness. Whereas common sense tells us it is precisely their consistency which is out of this world and proves they must be a fabrication. What Arendt is referencing here is these kind of show trials in the Soviet Union, where enemies of the revolution would be rounded up and put on trial, and would be made to confess all the terrible things they did. And all their confessions would kind of sound the same. Now, us watching this might think, obviously, they're being forced to confess to their crimes. Look at by the state, because there's kind of a fake consistency in their reasoning. They're all saying, oh, the capitalists made me do it. I'm an enemy of the revolution. I'm a saboteur. But if the language is too similar, we're going to think to ourselves, no, they were put up to this. They're being forced to say it. But if you're in the network of Soviet propaganda, it's precisely this consistency will prove it to you. Because the consistency of the system is what makes it, what gives it its appeal. So again, this is all why certain kinds of propaganda work differently than other kinds. Right? In a democracy, public relations will work in a fundamentally different way than in a totalitarian system. A totalitarian system, of course, is one where all pushback is eliminated. There are no constraints on it. And the reason I'm talking about propaganda and totalitarian systems is not because we live in a totalitarian system now. Rather, it's partially a warning, and partially because one of the things that's happening online right now is that you have systems of information which have no outside kind of like oversight. Anything can be said, and no other countervailing force will push against it, which is in a way like a tiny little bubble of the totalitarian possibility, because nothing exists as a counterweight to it. Let me move on here. Here's something else Arendt says that's very interesting about the mass leader, about the mass appeal of totalitarian propaganda. It's in the perception that they have a certain kind of authenticity. And they get this because they are good manipulators of social taboo, of things they're not supposed to say. The spokesman, Arendt says, for totalitarian movements possess an instinct for anything that ordinary party propaganda or public opinion did not care or dare to touch. Everything hidden, everything passed over in silence became of major significance, regardless of its own importance. The mob really believed that truth was whatever respectable society had hypocritically passed over or covered up with corruption. I think this is really interesting, especially today, right? Because there are things that people don't want to talk about. And if you manipulate social taboo, even if you're lying, you have a sense of authenticity about it. Because the people that don't talk about it don't have a sense of honesty or telling it like it is. So one of the things you should watch out for when it comes to mass movement is the manipulation of taboo subjects. Let's see what are we doing for time here? We're about 1:06. Okay, let me just let me skip a couple slides because I want to shorten this. I've been going for an hour already. So totalitarian leaders as well. Another aspect of their rhetoric to keep in mind is that they have the habit, Arendt says, of announcing their political intentions in the form of prophecy, requiring eventually political power to carry out the prophecy. The most famous example, Arendt says, is Hitler's announcement to the German Reichstag in January 1939. I want again to make a prophecy. In this case, the Jewish financiers succeed once more in hurling the peoples into a world war. The result will be the complete annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. It's not a prophecy. Translated into non-totalitarian language, this meant, I intend to make war, and I intend to kill the Jews of Europe. This is a very dark episode of fake news. So to understand totalitarian propaganda and rhetoric is also to understand this aspect of it. As I said before, mass leaders don't believe in truth. They believe in action, and they will say whatever needs to be true to justify the actions they want. Let me give you a somewhat controversial example here from recent politics. I really kind of believe that birtherism, which is conspiracy theories that former President Barack Obama was not an American citizen, is kind of an example of believing what needs to be true in order to do the thing you want to do anyway, which is delegitimize the presidency. If you start with the belief that that Barack Obama is not a legitimate president, you will work backwards to whatever needs to be true. For example, a conspiracy theory that he was born in Kenya. So you can't take these statements as statements of literal fact and try to dispute and say, well, actually, if you go back to Hawaii, you could find the original birth certificate. There's a newspaper announcement in the 1959 edition of the Honolulu Gazette announcing the birth. There's all this evidence. You're wasting your time if you think about the evidence of it, because they're working backwards from the thing they believed to the fact that needs to exist, from the fake fact that needs to exist to justify their commitment. So when you start seeing things like this pop up in the public sphere, I get a little nervous. I get a little twitchy because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is kind of the stirrings of a certain kind of totalitarian rhetoric here. So here's another example. The Soviets were also really good at this kind of reality denial game. So because they believed in egalitarianism in theory, on paper anyway, they didn't like Darwin's theory of evolution, because evolution suggested that, right, you had a competition through natural selection and only the more fit reproduce. The Nazis loved this theory in a way because they had this idea of social Darwinism, which is, yeah, the more fit races will dominate the earth. But of course, all that is kind of misapprehensions of what fitness means. Right, social Darwinism is not a scientific idea. But nevertheless, the Soviets didn't like Darwinian biology, and instead they adopted an official state biology, the official biology of the Soviet state, Lysenkoism, under Stalin, which claims that acquired characteristics could be inherited, and that natural cooperation is what's in nature, not natural selection. Acquired characteristics could be inherited just means that, like, look, if I work out a lot and I get big muscles, then my children will inherit the big muscles. But that's not how that works, right? Whether or not I work out is not in my DNA, right? So this is just bad biology, right? So because social Darwinism was associated with fascists, it had to be false. Stalin supported this campaign. Biologists were jailed or executed because, right, it was bourgeois science. But Lysenko was communist science. So again, we have like the rejection of reality and the substitution of like a fake reality that is more in line with the consistent ideological world picture. How am I? Let me just skip some stuff here. You can look at it. Okay. One thing, let me just start closing up here. So one thing to also remember about propaganda is that it's not always really crude. Both the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin, and Nazi Germany were barbaric regimes engaging in campaigns of mass terror, imprisonment, and murder. But their propaganda was not always crude and sensationalistic. Right, here let me compare two Nazi newspapers here, Der Sturm and Volkische Beobachter. I have no idea how to pronounce this. I don't know why I'm trying to pretend. Right, most Nazi officials were kind of embarrassed by Der Stürmer, which was a tabloid, privately owned. It wasn't run by the state. The state kind of allowed it. And it was really notorious for its anti-Semitism, for its articles that were openly called for mass extermination. Distribution was in fact suspended temporarily during the 1936 Olympic Games in Germany because the Nazis were embarrassed of, right? So we definitely, I think of Nazi propaganda in terms of these racial caricatures. But the fact is, the official newspaper, the Nazi Party, over here, had a really respectable face, was promoting the successes of the Nazi regime, right? Here you have like just a guy with a profile look. He looks very like serious and noble, and they're not. The official organs of the Nazi Party did not look like this. They look like this one down here. Right? This is the official newspaper. This is the private tabloid that the Nazis thought was kind of embarrassing. So Nazi propaganda was not always crude and sensationalistic. So just to kind of close up here, the origins of totalitarianism is a giant 2-volume work that if you're interested in the history of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and totalitarianism is kind of a must-read. I can't cover the whole 2-volume work here. But for Arendt, looking back on the period of totalitarianism and of World War II, Arendt said, the big take home is that we can no longer afford to take what was good in the past and simply call it our heritage, to discard the bad and think of it as a dead load which by itself will bury in oblivion. The subterranean stream of Western history has finally come to the surface and usurped the dignity of our tradition. This is the reality in which we live. This is why all efforts to escape from the grimness of the present to nostalgia for a still intact past, or into the anticipated oblivion of a better future, are vain. What does this mean? Arendt is warning us. He says that if we think about history, we can't reconstruct a history in which the past of the West, whatever that means, is simply an uninterrupted stream of progress and glorious events. It's usurped the dignity of our tradition, the events of the Second World War. Totalitarianism, Stalinism, Marxism, fascism have killed millions of people. And as a result, we have to live with the fact that these are parts of our history now. And to move forward means always being warned, forewarned, and ready for another eruption of something like this, which is why it's so important to understand how totalitarian propaganda, in fact, operates. Because you don't need a full totalitarian state to start seeing the antecedents of it. All you need is a bubble in which it's allowed to fester and appeal to people who, from their circumstance or their existing beliefs, can be recruited into it on either extreme. This is why I would spend like an hour talking just about this in a fake news class, because online misinformation and disinformation can increasingly take the shape of these kinds of propagandistic forces, because lacking oversight, lacking the countervailing pressures typically found in a mass press, right, they will slowly evolve or devolve into the forms of propaganda we've seen here, which is why I really wanted to put it out as a warning near the end of the class. Look for these features. Look for mass populism. Look for invented worlds of ideological consistency. Look for calls to eliminate opponents, right, and resist them. Okay. That's what I wanted to say for today. If you have any questions about the assignments, send me an email. Thanks for listening. I know it got a little bit dark today. I skipped a bunch of slides. There's obviously, I have a lot more content here. I skipped a bunch of stuff. But thanks for watching today. And I'll see you next week.